Welcome to the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society. Welcome to ITSP Magazine. You're listening to a new The Hacker Factory podcast with hacker maker Phillip Wylie. You're about to discover what the role of a professional hacker entails, the different specializations it holds, and what it takes to learn and become one. Enjoy the conversation as Phillip and guests unveil the secrets of professional hacking, a mysterious, intriguing, and often misunderstood occupation. Knowledge is power, now more than ever.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Hacker Factory podcast. I'm your host, Phillip Wylie. I refer to myself as the hacker maker because I love helping people get started in offensive security, penetration testing, bug bounty, and all sorts of things offensive security related. Each episode, I have a really cool guest that shares their stories of how they got into the industry, their advice, and things that they've learned along the way that'll hopefully help you on your journey into cybersecurity. And so today we have our special Black Hat USA episode, where ITSP Magazine is an official media source for Black Hat USA. And I have Yarden with me today, and she works for CrowdStrike. She's got like a software development background and a security research background. We really hadn't got a lot into security researchers on the show so far, but it's a really cool area because these people, whereas a pen tester, you follow this methodology, you hack something, but security researchers, they got to figure out how to hack the things. And this is information that gets shared on later on that pen testers use to try to duplicate the same thing. So thanks for joining the show.
Thank you for having me here. Happy to join.
That's great to have you. And I just found out about you through Black Hat. I was looking through the list of people and trying to find someone, and your story looks pretty unique. So I think you've got a lot of cool things to share with our audience. Why don't you start out with just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Absolutely. Well, I'm Yarden. I'm a software engineer right now working at CrowdStrike. I used to work at a different company called SentinelOne. I did all sorts of different roles there. I started in QA, doing software testing. I moved on to doing some automation work, then security research, wrote some features, wrote some blogs, did some talks. I also teach Windows internals classes together with my co-instructor, Alex Ionescu, and sometimes by myself. I teach workshops. Specifically, I try to teach a lot of workshops in women minority conferences, mostly working in Windows environments. That's for my cybersecurity background. Other than that, I'm a circus artist. With COVID, I'm a bit of an unemployed circus artist. I do aerial circus. I used to perform. I used to teach a lot. Teaching is really a passion for me. I like teaching technical topics and non-technical topics. In my past, I was a pastry chef, so I can answer questions in a lot of, very wide variety of topics. If you want training or cooking or baking or tech, I can probably do any of those. So I sort of multitask between different things on different days. And I enjoy teaching. I give a lot of talks. I write a lot of blog posts. I very much enjoy sharing information.
Oh, that's very cool. That's one of the things I love to do as well. And interesting enough, you would probably be surprised that you're not the only one that's been on the show so far that does circus-related skills. I actually have a former student that is a penetration tester. That she's a fire breather, and so she did something with some circus-related stuff. So maybe the two of you get a chance to meet. She's speaking in the Adversary Village and IoT Village at DEF CON. I'm not sure if you're going to get a chance to see that.
I won't actually be at DEF CON this year, but it sounds very cool. And there's actually a surprising amount of tech people in the circus. Basically, everyone has a second job. A lot of times it's tech related.
That's very cool. That's one of the things I didn't know is that popular. So that's a podcast in itself, just covering, people, the circus people as security. So that's pretty cool and interesting to find someone else. As there's actually someone else I saw not long ago that's in a security community that had a picture of fire breathing. So it's kind of interesting that people that work in security would do that. So I guess that the circus thing is popular with people with curious minds. And so that's definitely an asset in cybersecurity. So would you mind sharing how you got started? How did you start your career?
Sure. It's not a very inspiring story as far as I can tell. Short version of it is I was right out of the army in Israel. I was broke and I needed to pay rent. And tech does tend to pay rent. I had absolutely no technical background or very, very little of it. So I just started sending a resume around and went to interviews for whoever had me, and found a job at this company, which was a very, very small startup at the time, Sentinel-1. Now they're not all that small. They just IPO'd as far as I know. But I started working there as a software tester. I just had a good interview there. It was a very small company. They offered me a job, so I went there, and it happened to be a cybersecurity company. And I just happened to be good at breaking stuff, which is a very important skill for a security researcher and a software tester. And when it's a new product, it's very hard to break. So I happened to be good at breaking stuff, and I joined the company. And while I was there, I started learning. I needed to learn. We needed to automate some things, so I learned Python. And then we needed to test the product more in depth, so I learned more about the product, which forced me to learn more about security and more about operating systems. And I just went around and asked all sorts of people all sorts of questions. We were 20 people at the time, so we were sitting right next to the developers, right next to the researchers, right? Everyone was having lunch together, so I just walked around and asked people questions, and they answered the questions, and I just started learning and doing whatever I needed to get my job done. And at some point started moving around the company after about a year and a half doing testing and automation. I wanted to change, so a few different teams in the company offered a move there. The research team looked like more my thing. I don't see myself as much of a developer, even though that's my job now. Research comes much more naturally to me. So I chose the research team. I knew very little about operating systems at the time. I didn't know the difference between user and kernel. I didn't know what a kernel driver was. I didn't know how to analyze anything. They showed me what Procmon was, and I tried to, poke it and figure out how it worked. And just, again, sat next to people, asked lots of questions, came up with a lot of ideas. I was the annoying little kid constantly asking why. And sometimes those whys are good questions, because sometimes it makes people realize that they don't actually know why things work and why they don't. So I just started probing into things and picking up my own projects and learn whatever I needed to learn, with a lot of help from other people I worked with.
So yeah, that's a really impressive resume. Your first two jobs, Sentinel-1, and then, because they're a little, I heard of them over the past couple of years, and then to work for CrowdStrike. So that's pretty impressive and good to be able to start out with companies like that. So I know you're from Israel, so that's pretty interesting, because we know in the US there's a lot of talent there. Because when I used to work for a company as a red team lead, and we had an office in Israel, and one of my red teamers happened to be there in Israel. So I know they're pretty well known for a lot of the software and some of the technologies and stuff. So that's pretty cool. So when you were in the military, did you learn much about anything cybersecurity related, or?
Okay. No, not at all. A lot of the talent in Israel comes from, a lot of what is known as the talent in Israel comes from the cybersecurity areas of the military, Unit A200 and all that. I wasn't in any technical role in the Army. I didn't learn any technology there. I had a very basic understanding of security. It was a very vague understanding of what security was for the purposes we had at the time, but I wasn't in any technical role, and I don't come from that same background. It also made it a little bit more difficult to get into this industry because I didn't come through the same pipeline as most people. Since it's a very small country and a very small industry there, even though it's very dominant, it's very much based on who you know, like it is in a lot of other places. And I didn't know anyone because I didn't come from that background. So I just sort of started and went with it. But it did make it a little bit more difficult at first, just to get that initial step. Because I didn't have those contacts and I didn't have that knowledge. I didn't even know what knowledge I needed to have.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that part of your background, because there's a lot of people that are trying to get started, and some people may not have that computer science background or that degree to get started. So that's pretty awesome to see that you've gotten to where you did without having that prior background.
Yeah, I found that the most difficult thing for me when I started wasn't not knowing things, it was not knowing what I don't know. Like, I knew I didn't know C, I knew I didn't know Python, but no one tells you that you don't know how to use Procmon or how to use Wireshark, or no one even tells you what reverse engineering is. So learn how to code. I could use public tools to learn how to do that, but I didn't even know what steps I had. I just knew I didn't know anything. That's not a very useful place to start with. So the most help I got when I started wasn't in the form of people teaching me things, it was in the form of people showing me where to start.
That's pretty impressive to come from where you were to get to where you're at. So you did a lot of hard work to get there. So that's very impressive. And like I said, that's good to be able to share that with people on the show that are trying to get started, because I have people all the time. I'm 30, I'm 40, I'm 50 years old. Is it too late for me? I don't have a degree or I don't have the certifications. Can I do this? And people come on like you would share your story, that someone that started out with that background, it's proof that if someone's willing to put in the hard work that they can get there. So.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a degree and I don't have a certification. I do get a lot of questions from people about, do I need a degree? What certifications do you recommend? Like, I have no certifications. I have no idea what certifications are recommended and which ones are useless. I don't know what you learn in the certificates. I don't know if they're useful. I know that the path I took is right for some people and not right for others, because my path also, I like to say, and people take it as a joke, but it's not really a joke, that the most valuable skill I had when I started in this industry was baking. And it really was, because what helped me in this industry was people, especially when I started and still today. I had mentors, I had friends who helped me. And when you don't have those initial connections, that initial link of, oh, you went to school with that person, you were in the same army unit with that person, you know each other from this or that place, then cookies very much help. They're very, very helpful in getting people to want to talk to you and help you. When you ask them the 17th question this hour and driving them crazy, knowing that they're going to get cookies is very helpful in motivating them to help you. So that's not necessarily a path that works for everyone, but it sounds a bit like bribe. And in a way, it a little bit was. I also always had way too many cookies, but I didn't have any technical skills. So using personal skills, the thing that people think wrongfully call soft skills, I think really made up the difference for me, because I needed something and I didn't have the hard technical skills to show.
Very interesting. And the baking thing took a totally different turn than what I expected. I thought you were going to say, yeah, from baking, I learned how to follow instructions, look at these ingredients and all this, but that's pretty cool. More the people side of the motivator. So that's cool.
Yeah, no, I'm not good at following instructions, not in recipes, not in the army, not in work. I'm not an instructions person. I'm also a very intuitive baker, so instructions are really not my thing. but it does teach you how to mix things together and make them work, which I think also translates to cybersecurity and specifically research.
Yeah, one of the things too I would say that would help too is do any kind of recipe, any kind of cooking or baking. You kind of learn to make those things your own, to add your own special touch. So I'm sure that's probably translated in your career too. There's this way to do this, but you kind of figured out on your own. If I do this, I can make it better. So kind of like baking.
Yeah, I mean, if you always follow a recipe, you're never going to make anything new. You're
That's
only
great.
going to replicate something that someone else already did. So following recipes is awesome, but at some point you do need to try your own thing, even if it's making this tiny little change in the recipe.
Yeah, that's great advice too, because even like the coding, you can follow some book and do step by step. If you don't try anything on your own, you're never really going to learn. So that's great advice. So what advice would you give someone, especially since you came from, you didn't have the background, you learned it all on your own. So I'm sure you have probably a better idea if you were able to start all over again and do it. Maybe you would do things different. So what kind of advice would you give to someone that wanted to become a security researcher like yourself?
Well, it's a hard question because there are a lot of different paths to take. You can start in 100 different places and get to 100 different places, and they'll all be right. But a very cliche advice, but there's a reason it's cliche, it's a good one, is if you have a question, ask it. Even if you think it's a stupid question, ask it anyway. It might be a stupid question, and that's fine. Everyone has stupid questions. But maybe it wouldn't be a stupid question. One of the things that really drove my career, especially in the beginning, was asking why don't we do it that way? Why do we do it this way? Sometimes the answer was because what you're saying is technically and physically impossible. But sometimes the answer is, oh, sure, let's try it that way. And sometimes you find pretty interesting. So if something doesn't make sense to you, ask. Maybe you don't know, but maybe it really doesn't make sense. If you have a question, just ask it. And even if in most cases the answer will be obvious to someone else, sometimes it wouldn't be. And even if it is obvious, you learned something that you didn't know, and maybe that you would have no other way to learn, because this field is not very well documented, and a lot of information only people's heads. So if you don't ask them, the information will not leave the person's head.
Very, very interesting point of view. Thanks for sharing that advice. So since this is kind of our special Black Hat episode, would you mind sharing a little bit about your talk with our listeners?
Oh, absolutely. So my talk is about the Windows kernel pool. It's gone through all sorts of changes. It went through a very, very major change in Windows 10, where it was completely redesigned and now works entirely differently from the way it worked before. This has all sorts of security implications. It got all sorts of improvements, new security features. But there's also some apps there, like there aren't any redesigns. So my talk is going to those changes, all those new mechanisms, what new types of kernel pool are there, how do we, as researchers, use them, look into them, possibly break them, what of kernel exploits aren't going to work anymore, what way, and what will probably be the new ways going forward with this change.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And so I see that you're giving your talk 2 different times during the conference. So I see Wednesday at 11:20 a.m. and Thursday at 1:30 p.m. So anyone's there, you definitely want to check out this talk. It sounds very interesting. And like when I was looking through the profiles, that was one of the things that kind of wanted me to interview, because one of the cool things about this show is I learn a lot from my guests, because there's people that work in these different areas. I mean, one of the things I always get to is do you have to be a coder? Do you have to know how to program to be a hacker? And then you got some people, believe it of all people, Alyssa Knight was on the show and she doesn't know how to program and she got by without programming. But then you talk to these other people that are really good hackers or uh, offensive security professionals and they know how to code and it really helped them a lot. So kind of what's your opinion on that? Would you recommend people learning how to program?
Like I'm never going to tell anyone, no, don't learn something new. That's ever good advice. To say that coding is something that you absolutely cannot start working in this field without, no, that's absolutely not true. But coding is always a strong tool to have. It's not necessarily the first thing you need to learn or the second or the third. I believe that after working in this industry enough time, long enough, then coding is just a useful skill just to make your own life easier. But don't block yourself from looking for a job, from going to some program because you think, oh, I'm not good enough because I don't know how to code. Because if you start putting those limits on yourself, you're always going to find something you're not good enough at. If you start looking for roadblocks, you'll find them.
Yeah, that's great advice. You know, we have enough things that prevent us from doing things in life, but whenever you start putting those roadblocks up yourself, that makes things any tougher. So that's some really good advice. But it's always interesting to hear the point of views on coding and how that helps. And I can see where it's really pretty much a needed thing for what you do. So what type of languages, you mentioned Python and C. So what all languages do you write in?
So my day job is in C. I can do C++ if you put a head, but you would pretty much need to put a gun to my head to get me to write C++. Even though that's my day job, I don't really see myself as a developer. I don't have a development background. I don't have development training. I do the job and I think I do it well enough, but I use the basics. I use C, I use Python. For debugging, I've had to learn JavaScript of all things, but I don't have a huge amount of languages, under my belt. I use whatever I need to use to get the job done, and that's pretty much it. I don't really learn to code in new languages as a hobby. I've never done that. I do a little bit of C# for like GUI programming when I need to, but I learn as much as I need to get to write the tool or program that I do at that moment.
So you mentioned, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
I don't consider development my strongest skill. So to me, it's just a tool, just like any other tool. You can learn that. You can learn reverse engineering. You can learn offensive security skills. You can learn how to use a new analysis tool.
So as far as reverse engineering, is there a specific tool or set of tools that you like to use for reverse engineering?
I use IDA with Hexrays. I've gotten addicted to Hexrays and learning how to clean up the code to basically make it look like source code again. So that's my main tool. Again, I use the basics. I use IDA for static analysis, and I use Windbag or WinDBG, whichever way you like to call it, for dynamic debugging and analysis. And that's about it. I don't really have anything fancy to recommend. The basics work well for me.
Good. Very interesting. So I know a lot of people, Ghidra has been a big deal in recent years since I guess it was during RSA in 2019 that they kind of did a talk on it, and it seems to have gotten really popular since then. So I was kind of curious to see if you would mention that tool or not.
No, actually, when talking about technology, I'm pretty conservative. I work with what I have, and I'm very slow and very hesitant to adopt new things because I have the tools that I know and like, and I really don't rush to playing with new toys just because it's never really been my thing. I need to really, really feel a need for a new thing before I go and adopt it, and even then, there is a bit of hesitation around that for me.
Yeah, that makes sense sometimes too, especially when you're talking about tools for reverse engineering and debugging and all that. All the time you would spend trying to learn those new features, you could be using what you know and and making progress on whatever projects and stuff you're working on. So I could see that.
Yeah, it's also a matter of approach. I've never been very technical as a child. I got into this industry when I was 20, and I never had any technical inclinations before that. Until I started doing research work, I didn't even think I would be any good at this sort of technical thing. So I just don't have the natural approach to new technology. You know, I wasn't a kid who played with all the new shiny gadgets, so I never adopted that.
So just curious, what kind of hobbies do you have? Because I know you'd mentioned the things with the circus and that sort of thing. So is there any kind of hobbies that you do to get away from technology, or is technology kind of a hobby too?
Yeah, I'm in between work and teaching and research and keeping a decent training schedule and eating once in a while and maybe sleeping once every couple of days. That's pretty time consuming. So I don't really have time.
Okay.
My hobby is usually either circus or tech, depending on which one is my focus at the time. They move around. One is a main and one is a hobby at any time. Cooking and baking has always been a hobby. I never made a career out of it. And I used to draw and paint a lot. I still do once in a while, just not as often as I used to.
So with that busy schedule, how do you prevent getting burnt out? Because I mean, you with teaching and all that, and the day job and the conferences and all. How do you have work life balance and prevent getting burnt out? Do you have any recommendations for that?
Again, not the most inspiring answer. I don't have great work-life balance. Um, it changes. Sometimes it's better, sometimes it's worse. Generally, I am not really great at balancing these things. For me, forcing myself to have a training schedule helps because I physically need a training schedule. So it forces me to take a break from work and computers and stuff once in a while and really physically reset for an hour or two or three, or as long as they train that day. So for me, that really helps. That's my main balance from away from sitting in front of a screen.
Yeah, sometimes it's hard to break away from that stuff when when that stuff's kind of your hobby. So it's always interesting to hear what people have to say about that. So we're getting close to the end of the show. Is there anything you'd like to discuss that we didn't discuss during our talk?
I don't think so. I don't have anything structured to say here. The things that I do always try to focus on, and I think don't get enough focus in our industry, is first the need for creativity and to develop your creativity, keep to keep doing creative things outside of tech. I find that really, really helps with driving your creativity in tech, which is needed regardless of what branch of cybersecurity or tech in general you're going to use. So getting, some creative hobby, if it's dancing or painting or cooking or whatever it is, I find really helps. Second, a general piece of advice that is useful in any field, and I find myself giving it a lot in Circus to my students, is to never compare yourself to other people, because you're always going to come out on the worst side, because that's what you're trying to do when you compare yourself. If you got to compare yourself to someone, take benchmarks of yourself and compare yourself to you of 6 months ago, 12 months ago, 18 months ago. That's one of the reasons I like to take pictures, videos, write articles, have little private GitHub repositories, so I can look back at what I did a year ago, go, oh wow, this is terrible. I am doing so much better now. And that really helps those days where self-esteem drops and you think you're doing terrible. Looking at something you did a year ago and going, oh my God, this is awful. What was I thinking? Because then you've made it doesn't feel that way.
Yeah, that's great advice. That's a good way to do that, just to compare yourself to yourself. Because I run into so many people that, have problems with confidence or imposter syndrome, and I tell them that it's not something that you outgrow. You just have to find ways to deal with things. And I think going back and comparing yourself creating benchmarks of where you're at and where you're at now is great, because these are skills you use in other areas of tech too, going back, comparing previous versions and so forth. So that's great advice.
In Circus, I think that's useful in any field you do, any hobby. I think that's just generally a useful thing to do, not necessarily in tech.
That's good. And I think, too many times when you look at structured education, a lot of times they don't show you to do things like that. So it's a lot of things people are missing, and people are dependent on people like yourself to provide that kind of advice to help them out.
I have a lot to say about structured education, but I think that would fit into a whole different episode.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on that sometime, but it's really interesting how that all works. And yeah, sometimes the time people spend in college, like in the US, some of the things that if you're going to school for computer science, then I know some of these things are to make you a more rounded person, but some of these things aren't really needed by some people, and that's not really their thing. Now, if you like art, having art classes or art appreciation is good, but if there's something else that you could do in place of that, then I think that would be a better option. But
yeah, I believe that everyone needs to find their own path. As someone who didn't go through the standard, high school, technical, military unit, university job path, I took a few months off work to go to Circus school, for example. I very much believe that everyone needs to find their own path and just go with it. If it works for you, go with it. There's no check boxes to check.
Very good advice. So we're down to the end of our show, and I'd like to thank you for being a guest. It's been great talking to you. I did not know of you, but I look forward to following your work in the future.
Thank you so much. It was a great time being here, and thank you for having me here.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks for being our guest. And thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you on the next episode.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Hacker Factory podcast with Phillip Wylie. If you learned something new and this podcast made you think, then share itspmagazine.com with your friends, family, and colleagues. If you represent a company and wish to associate your brand with our conversations, sponsor one or more of our podcast channels. We hope you will come back for more stories and follow us on our journey. You can always find us at the intersection of technology, cybersecurity, and society.